Well, welcome to our webinar. We're going to be going over from operator to CFO, winning the leadership transition in 2026. And we've got some great panelists here today. We're joined by Bryan Graiff, who's the Midwest GEO leader of Armanino, and then our own Younium's own co-founder and CEO, Niclas Lilja. Guys, if you could do a quick introduction of your background and yourself, that would be an amazing way to get things started. Bryan, let's kick it off.
Thanks, Jeremy. Really glad to be here. As Jeremy said, I'm the Midwest Geo Leader for Armanino, primarily in an 11-state area. But I also lead our manufacturing industry, and prior to that, I led our private equity industry, which had a lot of overlap with venture capital as well. And a couple of things just about my background, I think, as far as the setting goes, is I'm actually at a crossroads in my career where I've worked 17 years in corporate and 17 years in public accounting. Armanino is a full service public accounting firm that does audit, tax, and specialty consulting, all the consulting services. What makes us unique is that our largest industry is technology, followed closely by manufacturing and industrial. But we lead with technology in all of our solutions. We've adopted artificial intelligence into our solutions, and we're a big tech implementation firm. So having an accounting firm to help you with your technology implementation and adopting AI, I think is a huge advantage. And I go back to my CFO days, and we'll talk a lot about the transition from more of a controllership role to a CFO days. Technology was such a huge component of understanding what needed to be done to help lead the organizations that I worked at. And I also, at the end of the program, we'll talk a little bit about a survey that our firm does. We have over 10,000 clients, and we do a CFO evolution survey. And a lot of the survey results are going to be supported in the conversation that we have today, and we'll make that available to you after this program.
Excellent. That sounds amazing. Bryan, thanks for sharing your background and what Armanino does. Niclas, you want to give a little background on your end as well?
Sure. A background in SaaS software for the last 20 years. Was on the side of accounts payable automation for quite some time, and then took the step to go over to accounts receivable, as I usually say it. Leading Younium now, so we're operating in with doing subscription billing and subscription management, and moving very much into having a agentic platform for software, AI, and tech companies in the B2B space, so they can monetize, operate, and grow their business. Yeah.
Well, all right.
And with that.
So we got two incredible panelists with us today. Our goal really is to run through not just things that we've heard, but real life stories, trends, and tactics that you can use to excel as a financial leader in transition in 2026. So whether you're a first time CFO, or you're a CFO joining a new company, or you're just looking to take on a larger role in finance in the near future, we should have you covered with some great data, great stories, and great intel on this call. So we've got a lot to discuss in a very short period of time. We'll make sure to leave some time at the end for some questions if you have them. But why don't we start and dig into our first segment, which is really from operator to CFO, what changes and why it matters. So, Bryan, I think maybe if you could kick us off with just the difference in roles, whether you're a VP or a controller moving into a CFO role, and then maybe some of the top three biggest skills that you will need to adapt to in that role.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So a little bit of background here. So when I was a controller, back in the days when Sarbanes-Oxley came out, the CFO role had evolved a lot prior to that. And Sarbanes-Oxley kind of grounded the CFO role in needing to understand the accounting and be more of the CPA, CFO. And that's evolved over the last 20 years. But one of the challenges I saw in making that leap from controller to CFO, and I think this really applies to any size company. Every company that you work at is going to be dealing with, is this the right CFO for this particular type of company? And whether, you've just done a capital raise, you're pre-revenue, you might need a certain CFO. If you're $100 million company trying to get to 500 million, you did need a different type of CFO. And what I had to transition myself was going from more of a rear view looking, reporting the numbers, making sure the numbers were right, and being in the weeds every day, making sure that the numbers were 100% accurate, to being more of a strategic, visionary CFO. And that's a tough transition when you're always looking in the rear view mirror now to be looking out forward and being responsible for those projections. Even if you do a bottoms up budget and forecasting process and you're getting the numbers from, all your different business units, you still have to put on your forward looking hat and be more strategic and help drive the company because you've got access to the numbers. And so to me, that strategic visionary CFO was kind of the first step that needed to happen. The next thing, in the CFO role is really gaining a great understanding of your people. That was back in those days most important because I kind of walked into companies where the technology was what the technology was. Back in those days, private equity firms, private companies weren't really willing to make $1 million investments in their technology 20 years ago. The private equity world kind of looked at, we'll let the next buyer deal with those things. So a lot of times it was figuring out how do I maximize the usage of what we had. Today's CFO is totally different. There are so much more technology tools out there that you do need to come in and make a quick assessment and understand, the systems that you have today, are they the systems that can really support you for the next 5 to 10 years and really help you make the right decisions from a system standpoint. The people side's never going to change. I do want to kind of point out, if you're new to that role, if you've been running an accounting department, some of the people challenges. I mean, our data suggests that there's 120,000 CPAs retiring every year and only 80,000 accountants coming out of college. So we know there's a shortage on CPA caliber people out there in the workforce, and a lot of discussions about the grain of the workforce, the baby boomers that are retiring. The people side's a never-ending challenge. You got to make sure you got the right people. Uh, as we get into AI, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion out there now about how AI is not going to take over the world. But the people who know how to use AI are going to take over the world. So you've got to make sure your people are up to speed with how to implement AI and understand the systems. And if you don't have the people, you've got to figure out other resources there. And then the final third thing that's most important that sometimes gets overlooked, especially moving from that controller role where you're overseeing everybody's expense reports and stuff like that. Now you go into a CFO role and now you might be the person approving the expense reports or having more oversight into what other business unit leaders and their people are doing. My approach was I did not want to be that gotcha CFO. And I say that because early on, as I transitioned into that role, I had sales and operations leaders come to me very skeptical of my role because a predecessor was kind of that, oh, this person's the one reporting all my salespeople who don't turn in their expense reports on time, or, trying to make my operations people look bad by pointing out inefficiencies and stuff like that. And so, you can be in a very collaborative partnership role when you understand the data and you work with your partners to really help them be successful. So I learned that early on. I think it's something where you want your peers to really look at you as trying to help them. Now, you also have to balance the role with your relationship with the CEO, which I know Nicholas will talk to a little bit too, and help reinforce this because a lot of CEOs are looking to their CFO. Tell me what I need to do. to run the company better, to manage the leadership team better, because they're looking at you as the person with a lot of the answers. You've got the data, you've got the accounting results, you got the financial results, financial projections. You're seeing things maybe quicker than the CEOs seeing them, but the CEOs out there talking to all the leadership team and need you to help them. But you don't want to be that person that's seen as, I'm helping my peer over here, but then I'm going telling my CEO, oh, you need to get rid of this guy because they're awful. So you've got to balance that fine line of providing the data and let the data speak to itself, helping the CEO make the right decision, but also helping the leadership, your peer leaders, make the right decisions. You can provide the data, and here's your top sales and what they're producing, and they can make their own decisions if you give them good data and it's accurate and they trust it and they trust you, that you don't have an underlying motive in mind. Unfortunately, there's some CFOs who, have a grind or an axe to grind with somebody, and they think that that'll solve problems, but it never does. You want to work with your peers and help them be successful. So, it's that strategic leader making that transition, which is not easy to do. And just one real quick point: when I did a leadership assessment tool, I was ranked as strong as the CEO in every category except strategic and vision. And that really bothered me. And I sat down with my CEO and he walked me through it. And he said, Bryan, you look in the rearview mirror all day long. I'm always out there looking around to see what's around the corner and what's out there 30, 60, 100 days from now, a year from now. You've got to start thinking like that. And once I did, I think it really helped my strategic visioning. Strategic visioning, understanding the technology and your people, and then that peer collaboration.
It's a lot of great information there. I think, a lot centers around your relationships with everybody else in the company. And one thing that I think maybe is missing in the modern world that we're living in is how do you forge these relationships when most companies are remote? Our company, we're across what, 5 or 6 different countries that you would have to do that if you were in the CFO role trying to get in touch with people and forge those relationships. It's not the same as those days that you mentioned, even 5 years ago before COVID. A lot of times, most of your team would be under one roof. So, how do you go about doing that now? And then I'll have Niclas weigh in on his perspective from a CEO and the expectations of what you just mentioned of a CFO.
Yeah, boy, I tell you what, too, when you're somewhat of an accounting focused CFO or an accounting background CFO, I mean, I'm an introvert by nature, and so it is a bigger challenge for those data-oriented people who are not, a salesman type person or charismatic, like to get out there and talk to everybody. But what I learned during the COVID period, I heard a saying that the people who are good people leaders and good communicators before COVID figured out how to utilize technology to be even better. The people who were not good at that blamed technology and people not on site for why they couldn't be good at it, and they even got worse in some capacity. I mean, the opportunities with virtual meetings now that can happen, just by sending a Teams note to somebody, say, hey, can you hop on a video call? I mean, the technology that's there to communicate even better is out there. But you have to work hard at it, especially if you kind of introverted by nature, because that teamwork and that collaboration is so important. And especially if your team is not physically on site working together, it does take a lot more work to make sure, everybody understands and they're all, rowing the boat in the same direction. So it takes work, but the technology tools that are out there can really help you be more effective at it.
Amazing. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit over to Niclas's perspective from a CEO. If you had a new leader coming into play, um, what would your expectations of that CFO be?
Yeah, and I think this maybe emphasis a bit of what Brian just said, but I think a general holistical perspective on things, not being too niche. It's still like I see it as, okay, we are two persons gonna work together as a team. We're probably gonna have different perspectives on the same thing, but we're still here as a team, and we're gonna, move things forward. And that is the strategy, it's the execution, it's the alignment. Um, and of course, it's from a vision and a strategy perspective, but I do think when it's a good teamwork, it's also backed by numbers and facts, and you get a bit of both, and hopefully they align. And if they don't, you have something to figure out, right? That is probably the biggest thing, and yeah, maybe a bit like what was previously said as well. What has been done has been done. You can only do so much about it, but you can really influence the coming weeks, months, years, right? So like, how do we do that? How do we model the expected results? How can we measure progress? How can we do that? And I think that is, I mean, maybe you don't need the title CFO necessarily, but you definitely need the person who is able to support you with that. And I think like uh, what was also said, like finding this alignment across functions and teams as well, like just having the same data. I think it's quite common that you have a function like a sales team or a development team sitting on their own data, and I like this concept of like finance grade data, which doesn't really have a best before date. But when you're looking at like you're having a team or like a discussion around some sales number, they may be enough accurate to make a decision right now, but they have definitely a best before date. So you don't want to really use it for historical purposes like 1 year later, because it hasn't been checked, it hasn't been reconciliated. You don't really have that finance grade quality data. So I think that is also something that when finance can do a bit more and be a bit more in control of the data, you get high quality and a bit more like finance grade data. And I think that is also something that makes it easier both for the CFO and the CEO to sort of, okay, let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about what we do know and move from here. So yeah, I think
And
that's
Nicholas, if
the
I can
most
just add to
important
that, yeah, I had a lot of experiences in my career where I was trying to explain to the leadership team that we have to have one source of the truth,
thing.
one source of where the data is coming from. But I wanted to always say, unfortunately, whatever you guys are using, this is the source of the truth because this is what's going in the general ledger and this is what's being reported in the financial statements. But again,
Yeah,
trying to be a peer collaborator partner, I found it a lot better to spend time with those leaders and ask them, well, what tools are you using? What reports are you using to run
mm,
your business?
mm,
I, let's make sure that it's tied into the data that's flowing into the general ledger, which
yeah,
has to be the source of the truth.
yeah,
But maybe, there's a way we can make sure both are the same and you're getting the best data to run your business. And a lot of times what we found was, they were they're good intentions and they were the right types of
mm,
metrics, but it wasn't completely linked into the ERP system that flowed into the general ledger. And once we made those tweaks and we figured out, we're going to change this report a
yeah,
little bit to make sure it's pulling all the right data, then we
yeah.
we were a better leadership team after that.
Yeah, and you probably have to go a bit towards each other, right? It's quite easy to work in your silos and like stay with your own set of data, doing your own decisions, but really coming together. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Brian, you said something interesting before about it was walking that line of providing that specific data to each of the critical business units, whether it's sales, whether it's marketing, whether it's customer success, so on, as your own finance team, giving those professionals and those people that were hired to be leaders the data that they need, the data that the company is going to use, and then letting them make the critical decisions. And that's really important for, I would imagine, you as a CEO to know that the people that are on your team, your C-suite or your VPs are always going to have the data, and then you can hold them accountable because ultimately that's your job from the top is to oversee everything.
Of
And
course.
knowing that they have the data, knowing that you have the exact same data so that you can hold them accountable. So if it was sales, you have an underperforming rep, and it's clearly identifiable by what Bryan provides you, now you can say, well, what's going on here? What is the reasoning behind this? Have intelligent conversations, not have to dig, not have to waste time getting to what the critical conversations need to be from your end.
Yeah. I think waste is a very good word to summarize what happens if you don't have it in check. You talk about things that are not really moving anything forward. It's
Yeah.
just like internal heat generating, and yeah, therefore should be discarded. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
a
think I'd
consistent
also add
buzzword
to
is
it.
usually efficiency, right? And efficiency is
Yeah.
is limiting waste. We talk a lot about efficiency, but not a lot on how to get there. And it usually comes down to is everybody looking at the same data in the same way?
Yeah, I was going to add to it too, where Nicholas used the term silos. I love that word. I also hate that word. But that's what I saw I had to break down a lot. And the other thing that I learned a lot was that these business unit leaders had great reports or the right they had the metrics. They knew how to run the business and they were utilizing those reports, but we weren't making sure they were all tied in and working together. And as a CFO, I don't want to be the last person to see the numbers. So, by working with the business unit leaders, they had good reports that started giving me more of that strategic foresight to do projections because they were seeing things before they got to the general ledger, which helped me be a better forecaster and strategist to help the CEO. And in some cases, the CEO trusted their leadership but wasn't seeing everything. And so in the end, we would develop tools that would help all the leadership team see what everyone else was seeing. And it made us better as a team.
It's a really nice segue because the next portion of what we wanted to discuss was, okay, that's a really nice endpoint, assuming, hey, I've got all the data cleaned up, I can provide this, I've got the relationships built. The first 30 to 90 days have to be mission critical. So what would you prioritize and how would you go about establishing all of that really as quickly as possible?
Yeah. So I go back to kind of the three important things as you're transitioning. I mean, it's still the people. You got to understand the team that you have. And again, if it was a team that was built to raise capital and be pre-revenue, and now all of a sudden you've got revenue and you got different types of controls and things that need to be put in place, it could be a different team that to get you to that next level, to that $100 million level, to the $1 billion level, to go public. And in my career, I did go through an IPO. I was brought into a company that did not have an SEC ready finance and accounting department. But I was brought in because I had that background to help the company go through an initial public offering. I was at a family-owned business that didn't have anybody that had a CPA, running a company that had gotten to $40 million, and within 3 years we were 200, $300 million. And so I had to have the I had to be able to assess people really quickly. And unfortunately, a lot of times in a controller job, or even if you came out of public accounting and you stepped into that CFO role, a lot of times you're not completely responsible and accountable for the hiring and the firing of people. And that's a big leadership change that you've got to learn. And it's tough. It's tough when you have to let people go because the company's outgrown them or they're not performing at that level. So, I mean, the people side you can never underestimate. And like I said, the challenges of having less resources out there today than 5, 10, 20 years ago when there were more baby boomers still in the middle of their careers. And there's a lot of accounting and finance resources out there. Today's a bigger challenge. The system, like I said before, was just figuring out how the system worked and making putting band-aids and duct tape around it to make it work. Now you've got to be able to step back, and maybe IT reports to you, maybe they don't. You've got to collaborate with your CIO and say, what are our system limitations here? There's so much software technology out there to help us run this business better. How do we take advantage of it? And then, unfortunately, as a CFO, how do we finance those costs to be able to make that investment? Some of the biggest things I always heard was, Bryan, you're overhead. We're sales, we're operations. Well, systems actually add a ton of value to the business. So you've got to figure out how do you support that return on investment. And then finally, that collaboration piece with your peers. That starts on day one. You've got to get out there, as introverted as you might be. You got to get out of that office and you got to meet your peers. You got to go to lunch with them, maybe go out for drinks afterwards. They've got to know that you're the CFO, but they also got to know that you got their back and you're going to help them be successful. And that's day one and every day thereon is always making sure that your peers know that you're part of that team with them to be successful.
Nicholas, from your perspective, like that all sounds amazing. I would imagine you'd want them to get a handle very quickly on the key metrics because whoever was there before, or if there wasn't anybody there before, there's got to be a period of time in the beginning where it's a check of, am I operating off of the data that I should be operating off of, or should I question this until we get it cleaned up? Is that something that goes through your head in a scenario like this in a transitioning time?
Definitely, and I think maybe it also starts, already understanding the domain and what is important, what is not important, because typically you would have maybe a large portion being quite generic, but then there are a few pieces that require some special treatment that is a bit unique to the industry or perhaps even unique to the company. But those are not many, just like the a few things, but like finding those, and I think it's quite easy that people think something else is most important. That is not really the most important thing. So I think that like figuring out what is truly, truly important. I think I mean, we meet mainly a lot of like SaaS software tech companies, and one example is like what's different. Well, many grow quite international and global quite fast. They don't have a lot of retail stores. They don't have a lot of manufacturing plants. They are quite, global from day one. If someone downloads it, they don't know from where it is. But all of a sudden, they are operating on a global scale, but they're still quite small. That is different. That puts some specifics into place, like how to deal with that. But on the other hand, I can also say, for a software company, there's only really quote to cash that is a bit difficult. The rest is fairly standard, let's call it that, and straightforward. So I think like figuring out like what is unique, where should I really try to understand it, and where can I just draw on my experience, and what is like generic, I think that is important as well, because it's otherwise I think it can be quite difficult, that 30, 60, 90 days, time moves fast, right? So I think that could be one thing of narrowing it down a bit, and then just like navigating sort of the being open and listening in, but also moving into execution. There's a balance here, and you need to go from one to the other in some time as well, and I think that is maybe also worth thinking very much about before. And I mean, quite common, right? Having 30 days maybe to be open and then more or less decide to move on. But I think those are a few things, and of course, like you said, based on that, there are a few things that you definitely expect depending on your industry, on your environment as well. So for us, it's ARR, for instance, annual recurring revenue. If we don't have that, then we have a problem. If we have that, we can wait a minute or two for the next one, right? So
yeah, I'm laughing at Niclas because what he said really resonated with me about not having the luxury of time sometimes because my very first CFO job, again, it was a company that had grown from like 5 million to 40 million and projected to grow at 40 to 50% a year. And kind of a career coach who kind of helped bring me in was talking to the CEO saying, Brian should spend like the first 100 days understanding the business and learning everything. And the CEO looked and said, we don't have time for that. Brian's got to start adding value tomorrow. And I was like, oh, wow, that was a shocker. Like, I thought the first 100 days was, yeah, just kind of go to lunch with people and understand the company and the business. And there was no time for that. And that was 15, 20 years ago. And today the world's moving even faster. So unfortunately, yeah, you don't have to have the luxury of going around just talking to people for 100 days. You got to jump right in and start adding value.
Are we down
Absolutely.
to hours?
Well, I think that really is a nice segue into the next section, which is why is everything so sped up now? And a lot of it has to do with the amount of tech that gets you the data that you need quickly, but that comes with its own drawbacks. So when we think of tech as the CFO's operational backbone, so to speak, I think it's really important to run through what should be in place, what might be some red flags to look for in your initial assessment of what the company already has, and then go into more critical decision making of when is it time to rip and replace something or add something to your current tech stack, and then also take a look at it as tech enhancing the efficiency of the hires that you have and how it impacts hiring moving forward as you expand. So, Niclas, we run into a huge amount of different scenarios here at Younium when we're having conversations with both new and existing finance executives. But what's your opinion on some must-have capabilities in a finance tech stack for the subscription businesses in the modern world that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think the last section is really important. Like what is the world that we're living in right now? And I think we can all see that it's quite a tough climate, right? There's a lot of macro, not only being a tailwind. There's a big push for efficiency, right? How can you have growth and profitability, and a lot of this and that, and I think that puts a lot of pressure on all companies. And I think like looking a bit towards the software tech industry, I think we had a pretty good time up until 2021, right? And maybe we were allowed to only focus on a few things, and now we need to focus on more things. And I think that brings us to, you definitely need to be in charge of your customer contracts. And your customer contracts will no longer only be, seat based. Oh, this company has 10 seats, this company has 20 seats. Those days are typically gone. There is a pressure for having, maybe a bit more custom unit of measures. Not everything is in seats. Maybe the value is in API calls. Maybe the value is in number of texts, and maybe the value is in AI tokens, or results produced, or there are so many things, and you need to have an infrastructure that allows you to stay current with your times, and be able to introduce these pricing models. I think that is one that is really, really key. I think the other one is really around, like, most companies need to work with small companies, with large companies. As you grow, it's very, very difficult, and only a few are sort of allowed or can remain with only big, large enterprise, or only a large volume of small customers. Most have to do a bit of both. And then you have to think about, how do we do the sales-led motion? How do we do our online channel? How do we get that to work together? And I think it's a bit like, how retail was. For some time, the brands, they had one shop online and a physical shop that was totally separated. Speaking of silos, right? And over time, they grew to, they grew together, and you were able to have one experience crossing both online, the store, etc. Right? And I think the same goes for the software and SaaS industry. You have to serve your customers in whatever channel they want to be served in. And that leaves you with having payment method from cards. It could be invoice, it could be ACH, but it could also be, like 3-year terms, or it could be pay as you go monthly. And maybe it's seats, but it's also a consumption model. So it just becomes a bit more complicated. And you want that to be tied together, what Bryan said before, like you don't want this to be on the side and producing a lot of data, and then someone, maybe the CFO, comes saying, well, I don't really trust that data. You have a big problem. I mean, you want that process and that data to be tied into your general ledger. You often also want it to be tied into your customer experience in your product, or as a self-service portal or whatever. And that requires a lot of thinking and great systems as well. And thirdly, I think it was mentioned before as well, but like we have a lot of conversations of digging into data. Not only what is the recurring revenue, not only what was the churn last month, but more in detail. And I mean, as of lately, also, people want to do this from their ChatGPT client, or they want to do it out of some other. We're not in favor of any particular brand here, but so you definitely want open systems. You want systems with MCPs and open APIs that you can access, because it's very unlikely that people are going to be more efficient running around in 50 different chatbots. We don't see that. Being on top of that, I think, is very important.
Bryan,
Yeah,
did you have anything to add
if
to
I
that?
can just kind of reinforce what Niclas said from more of a CFO perspective, or help the CFOs understand their role in what Niclas was saying, is if a company's thinking about changing their revenue model, you've got to be out in front working with your salespeople, your CEO, to understand what that means. And if you're a CFO that says this is how we've always billed customers, this is how we have to do it in the future, you're gonna have some challenges here, because it sounds like the forward-looking CEO is starting to see that the customer buying patterns are changing, and we're gonna have to adapt, and they're gonna rely on the CFO to help the organization understand what does that mean. And then Niclas said about, again, kind of all the systems all tying together and flowing into the general ledger. In my role today on the public accounting side with all of our clients, unfortunately, I've seen some very large clients of ours who have a great ERP system. It all kind of flows into the general ledger, and then they still export it into Excel and make manipulations to it and do their financial reporting off of that. And that, you just can't do that. You've got to figure out how to utilize one system, get all the data in, and also do the reporting. And that's always been a drawback of a lot of the system technology, is that, it's designed for operational purposes and not necessarily for financial reporting purposes. But they are getting better. They all have a level of AI embedded in them, to help with projections and forecasting. So you've got to get your arms around that as a CFO and really make sure you've got the right technology solutions.
Yeah. And I was saying, like, being an enabler, that I should have said before, but I think like the CFO being an enabler, and that comes also from the tech perspective, right? For all the various departments and the different roles in doing their work. How can they look at the data? How can they be informed? And you said that before, but enabler, that is especially true if you have a very long relationship where, and I think that was the promise of services, right? Software as a service. It was no longer just a transaction, but it was actually a relationship over time. And you have multiple stakeholders doing things with your client over time that could influence the commercials or the financials. It could be finance doing an uplift. It could be your support team selling an add-on. It could be your product team or not providing the SLA, so you need to credit something. So what is now the current status when you're having a business review or you're connecting with the client again? So I think that is an example, like it's not so transactional and not so linear, right? It's a more of a network, and that, in my opinion, puts finance and the CFO at the center, and that is an opportunity.
So we talked before about that extreme period of the first 30 to 90 days, and that you're expected as a new finance leader to really have an impact immediately. There's no sit back and kind of relax and figure it out along the way. It's move at all costs and make sure that you're helping the other team members make great decisions. So to me, that means I've got to be able to identify red flags really quickly. And if I'm prioritizing reviewing my tech stack, reviewing my data, reviewing my teams, what red flags should I specifically be looking at when it comes to tech?
So is that a Niclas question or my question?
I mean, either one of you. This is whoever speaks
I can
first
start.
gets.
I can start, but I think like drawing a bit on what we just talked about. I think like the first thing I said previously, like, when you have a pricing change that can't be done because of the system, I think like then you're jeopardizing your entire company. That's not good, right? Like a bit more hands-on. I think like when you only have a reliable historical numbers, but you don't know anything about the future, despite having a contract that goes, 3 years into the future, and you know something about the future, but you just don't have the data. I think that is but then more technical, lack of open APIs. If you want to automate and, increase efficiency and you just hit the wall, I think that is definitely something to look for as well. And yeah, maybe very pointed towards our context, but I think like what we often hear is that no one really wants to admit it, but when they see that they have forgotten about a contract or some part of a contract for a year or two or three, basically leaving money on the table, that is usually an eye opener, and those are a few.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of go back to what Nicholas was saying too about, you know, identifying what everybody's using to run their businesses. Is it all flowing into the general ledger? You know, is it all one source of the truth? Those are the first red flags to look for. Are people using, things outside of the system to run their areas, and why are they doing that? And getting a good understanding. And then, a lot of this audience, I think too, cash flow is so important. And I failed to talk about that so far in the CFO role. But as a CFO, you've got to understand your cash. And when Nicholas made the comments about knowing your customer contracts and changes in your customer contracts, there's a lot of cash flow forecasting that's still done outside of the system in Excel, just because the financial reporting modules, they might be able to complete a cash flow statement as of a period in time, but it's not a great projection tool. And I do know that like our firm has an AI-based cash flow projection tool that gets better every week as you drop it in. A lot of private equity firms, if you're a CFO for a portfolio company, requires a 13-week forward-looking cash flow statement every week.
Yeah.
In the past, when I did that, I was the AI agent. I had to review it at the end of the day after my team spent all day putting all the data together. I had to make sure, did the change in inventory make sense? Did the change in receivables? Do the receivables on the books make sense with what the plants received out on, but based on what I talked to the operations leadership about? Having a good AI-based cash flow forecasting tool can really help you be looking out over 13 weeks and working with your CEO and your operations and salespeople to say, hey, I see something coming up in 9 weeks. We've got to get out in front of it, and making sure all those contract changes are adopted into your forecasting systems.
Absolutely. We've got a couple topics left, and we're going to try to squeeze in some Q&A at the end here. One of them is something that's a fairly hot topic right now, which is how do I know when to prioritize people versus tech? Obviously, there are so many areas where people are looking at AI replacing humans. But in the day-to-day world, we're looking at openings that we have because somebody left the company or hiring plans when we're looking into the future. So from a tech perspective, how do we look at when a good time is to make a hire and when a good time is to try to add some tech or get the most out of tech to enhance the people that we already have?
Yeah, I mean,
Niclas
like I
first.
said, from the finance perspective, the AI tools that are out there are so important for your people to be leveraging and taking advantage of at all levels. And it has to start at the top too. I mean, what we're seeing with our clients is the CEOs, just like back in the lean manufacturing days or continuous improvement days, the CEOs who just sat up there and said, go do that. That looks good. They're not leading from the top. The CEOs that are adopting AI and the CFOs who are using AI are the ones that their people see, hey, this is serious. We are going to take advantage of it. And I mentioned earlier, though, people shouldn't be scared of AI. They should be scared if they're not utilizing AI. There are going to be some job replacements, but there is going to be such an importance placed on that kind of that human still decision making out there with developing the relationships. Nicholas talked about relationships with customers. So AI is a tool. And the people who use those tools are going to help companies thrive and have success.
Niclas, do
Couldn't
you have
agree
anything
more.
to add?
Future-proof yourself and your company. I think that is the way to look at it. I'm also thinking I do. With that said, I think like if you know how to do something and you have people and you had the example of if someone is moving on somewhere else and you replace one, I would definitely look in like, okay, can we be more efficient? And then I'm also quite sure that it will still be a higher as well, but hopefully then doing something more value adding than what was then replaced by AI, for instance. It could be other tech as well. But I think like the whole like if you don't have anyone that is accountable and can be tactical and strategic for a relevant domain somewhere in the company, of course you need people, and then I wouldn't really hesitate at all hiring. But um, anything except that, I think we probably need to learn as well. So I think we should challenge ourselves,
Absolutely.
seeing if we can solve it otherwise. Yeah.
So kind of to tie this back to something that Bryan had brought up on the beginning of the call, we're looking to be able to equip people with the right tools and tools that aren't just right now, but tools that are scalable for the next 5 to 10 years so that you don't run into some of these areas that have red flags, so that you don't run into things that specifically will slow the growth of your business and that so that your data is as clean as it can possibly be. So at Younium, we believe that we represent a third pillar. Historically, the models from a pricing and product standpoint that are out there in tech and otherwise have been easily supported by CRM directly to ERP. But now with some of the modern issues and some of the modern structures that Niclas has gone through as far as pricing, as far as units of measure, as far as billing, as far as just SaaS being a thing in general, with those on the rise and continuing to change with the advent and addition of AI, there's really the need for a third pillar in the middle of those two to make sense of the data, to connect systems, to become, Bryan said the ERP should be the source of truth, but I think the ERP should be the result of truth that is pulled in from other systems, which can be gotten to if you have an appropriate piece in the middle that links all the data, cleans it all up, and gives people the right platform to view it from. So curious, Niclas, if you're in a period of growth as a company and you're looking at an older tech stack or something where there is something that needs to be addressed, and you're looking into a tool like Younium, what are some of the concrete signals or examples of when to pull the trigger on implementing something like Younium or something different in other portions of your tech stack?
Hmm. It's a great question, and I think, yeah, maybe drawing on some conversations and some experiences we have. I think we quite often hear like we replaced our system when we got new reporting requirements is sort of the general spectra. I think that could be definitely like private equity or some other finance. Could also be the new CFO coming in, right? So it's in that area, right? Like where you okay, you need to level up, you need to become more professional, and that is typically like, okay, we cannot do this is not worthy our size anymore because it's not robust enough. So I think that is one thing, quite general, and especially like looking a bit forward, like Brian was talking about, and the other one. The pricing model, we've been to that a few times, but like we replaced our system when we wanted to do some kind of typically introducing usage or some sort of variable component on top of whatever pricing you have is quite normal as well. Um, I think we will see a shift, and it started, but like hesitancy moving to systems or staying with systems if they cannot work well with AI tools. I think that is definitely in the start of it. It will only get worse. So I think that is a thing as well. But also the whole like we need to be more efficient. There used to be a saying, if you have a problem, there's a SaaS for that. No one really wants to have 100 SaaS solutions and pay enormous amounts for cooling, security, certifications. It doesn't make sense. So I think that is also like it's just the sum of the cost is just too high. I think many companies are realizing that as well and want to consolidate a bit.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there because what Niclas said about making sure your technology systems have AI adopted into it is so important. I mentioned our survey that our CFO survey that we did earlier in the presentation. And unfortunately, the results of that survey from, I think, well over thousands of CFOs was that only 21% of the companies have really embraced and adopted utilizing AI. I heard on the news the other day that, is there an AI bubble out there or not in the stock market? And somebody said, every company is an AI company now. So
Yeah.
if you're not using AI, you need to be using AI. And so when I see that only 21% of these CFO surveys said that their company have embraced AI, they're behind the curve. And unfortunately, I had a lot of AI workshops that we conducted as a firm this year with a lot of CFOs, clients, and prospects. And I would open up the conversation by saying, if I was sitting in your chair today, I'm not even sure where or how to get started. And they all looked at me and they said, we agree, Brian. We know our CEO is telling us, the board's telling our CEO, we need to be doing AI, but we're not sure exactly where to get started. And in the end, you've got to find a good partner, maybe it's an outside firm that can come in and partner with you to embrace it and start adopting it. And, it's like they say about how do you eat an elephant? Well, you one bite at a time. Just get started.
I love that. I think it's such an overwhelming topic for so many people, but it's not an excuse not to get started. There has been, in my experience with the hundreds of different businesses that I've met with over the last couple of years, there is a very common theme of a CFO or VP of finance being scared to make a mistake with implementing something like a system like Younium, for example, not because they don't believe that it won't do it, but because they won't maybe be able to justify the spend or something like that. But you are guaranteeing yourself a mistake if you aren't updating your tech stack. You're going to get run over by your competition. So I think one thing to take away that I've seen over and over and over again is this crippling fear of making a mistake by choosing something different than what you already have. If you've met all those red flags, if all of this information that we've talked about today is something that can be accomplished by adopting new tech, and you can't do it 100% right now with what you've already got, it's time to make a change. Otherwise, you're going to be held to the standard of a company that is losing on your dime and on your time, as opposed to a company that is innovating, keeping up with the times, and is competitive. With that, I want to open this up the last couple of minutes here. We ran through an hour relatively rapidly, but if there's any uh, questions from the attendees on this call, Hervoya, if you are back there, if you want to spring one up, that would be great. I think one of the questions that we have is, I'm looking to be promoted to my first CFO role. What can I do to position myself best prior to and during an interview? I think this is a really interesting question for either of you to handle, huh?
Yeah, so I'll try to give the perspective if it's with your existing company. Again, that leadership collaboration is so important. So I would be laying the groundwork with those other leaders in the other business units to make sure you've developed a relationship with them. How do they view you? Do they view you as the controller who was just pointing out again that their salespeople are not turning their expense reports on time? Or are you going to be that partner that's going to help them? So that would be one of the first things, again, if it was your internal company. If you're interviewing with an external company, again, I mean, it's so hard sometimes in maybe 3 1-hour interviews to really get a good feel for the culture. But in this day and age, it's not just the culture. It's like making sure you understand the technology stack that you're walking into, and as much as you can, the people skill set that you've got and where the company is in that evolution of growth, that you're going to need to get your arms around very quickly. So, there's a couple of things you can definitely do, and there's obviously lots of research on it. If it's a new company that you can find out, if you have access to the prior CFO or CFO you're replacing, that's going to be a wealth of information if you can, talk to them in advance. If it's your existing company and the CFO is retiring or moving on, that person can be a huge resource for you as well.
Nicholas, you want to weigh in on that from maybe the interviewing party side of things?
Yeah, I mean, surely, I think it. Um, I mean, there are different interviews and maybe tests and assessments throughout the way, but I would somehow assume that the finance part is in check, or we should find it somewhere in the process, right? But then it's very much about the how can you enable the other functions? How can you speak? Can you speak to me about sales? Can you speak to me about professional services? Can you speak to me about you know? So I would try to speak about the other things outside than of finance. Because if you're on that side of the table, I guess you kind of want to know, like, so how will this play out? So that would be.
Interesting. I think that should really help anybody that's out there that's looking to move up in the space. The interviewing world is quite daunting these days. I think we have time for one last question. Much of the tech stack you mentioned is very difficult to augment as a new leader. How would you recommend identifying an issue and starting the process of making a change in your first 6 months?
I think from my perspective, and I always use this as just a real easy thing for, especially if you haven't embraced the technology and made the improvements. I mean, if you think of Excel and just how powerful Excel is as a spreadsheet tool, which most accountants have grown up using Excel, and I think I've been told that we use maybe 10% of its capabilities. That's what I view ERP systems and technology is that most companies underutilize the tools that they have, and getting a good partner that can come in and help you maximize the usage of it, which means helping your people understand all the bells and whistles and all the tools that are available to them. It can make you so much more efficient. And again, it goes back to AI is not going to replace as many humans as they're projecting. And the same thing with technology. If you embrace it, and I think Nicholas used the term enabler, and you're utilizing that technology, it's going to make you so much more valuable. So the sooner you can get in and understand how underutilized the systems are, I think you can add a lot of value from just doing that.
Very good point. I think we're unfortunately out of time here. Obviously, if there's any questions that you didn't get to ask, please email us. There will be an email coming out that'll have some of the resources we've shared today, along with a summary, along with a recording, and a link to the report that Bryan had mentioned earlier. So we'll be able to get all of that in front of you shortly. Thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to joining you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.